Good morning, fifth grade. We're going to finish out our school year with changes in an ecosystem. So you guys have done such an amazing job. We're going to finish these last 7 school days out with going back into environmental sciences. You guys did such an amazing job with the circulatory system and the cardiovascular system. And we're going to go into certain types of stresses in our ecosystem. This is actually chapter, I believe, 8 in our book, but we're not going to do everything in that chapter. I'm going to kind of skip through certain things and just touch on some important parts. You guys remember when we talked about the fires that were happening in Australia and how it was basically it seemed like it was devastating the entire continent of Australia. And we talked about the types of damage that could result from all of the most of Australia being on fire. What were some of the things that we talked about with some of the issues that could have happened? Well, we saw some of the footage of animals being displaced, move out of their homes, or their habitat being completely destroyed. We saw people's homes being destroyed. And events like that, like a whole big forest fire or continent fire, it seems like a major tragedy, but the effects of that disaster can actually be helpful to an ecosystem. So we're going to be talking about different types of stresses on our ecosystem, how some of them can actually have some really good benefits and how some of them can have no benefits whatsoever. So let's begin our lesson with what changes in our ecosystem look like. So changes are always happening in our world, and some changes occur quickly, like a train wreck in the Sacramento River. So let's talk about that for a second. I'm going to go back to a story that is at the beginning of this chapter. You know how we normally start with like a debate and then, what we know. Well, we're gonna talk about this disaster that actually happened. July 14th, 1991, this train crossed the Sacramento River. So this is in upstate California, okay? Crossing the river. And as the train's moving down this train track, there's a sharp bend in the track where the train needs to turn. Several cars suddenly came off the track. So here you are, here we go. We have this train that's moving down the track. And as it's taking a sharp turn, all the cars behind it fell off the track. Now, about 19,000 gallons of the strong chemicals spilled into the river. That's a lot. So this train was carrying a bunch of these strong chemicals in it. 19,000 gallons. Now we know 1 gallon of milk, how big that is. Now imagine 19,000 gallons of that. It polluted the water, and the reaction formed this cloud of gas above the river as the chemicals slowly moved downstream. Now it's one thing if it fell into a lake and it kind of gets trapped there in that lake. It's another thing if it's in a swift moving river. So if I took food coloring and I poured it into a river, what's going to happen to that food coloring? It's going to be pulled right down the river. So let's picture this. 19,000 gallons of a really strong chemical being dumped into this swift moving river. Well, as that cloud was pulled downstream, the pollutant immediately began killing plants and animals as it made its way towards a lake in Northern California called Lake Shasta. People in the nearby towns actually had to leave their homes, and signs were posted along the river and the lake to keep people from fishing there or entering the water because it just wasn't safe. It took 2 weeks to reduce the chemicals in the lake to an acceptable level. There were still chemicals in there, but it took 2 weeks to remove enough so that it wouldn't damage too many things. But by that time, the damage had already happened. We had millions of fish and aquatic animals that died. And on land, because remember, water in a river doesn't just stay there. You have all the nearby plants and trees and all that are sucking the water from that river. Hundreds of thousands of trees were killed. Not just a couple, hundreds of thousands of trees. And a lot of land animals were actually forced to move in order to find food and shelter. Thankfully, over the course of several years, the ecosystem has recovered and is once again open to recreation. So, there's a lot that happened there. Now, let's go back to our unit here. So, Change is always happening, just like this is the train wreck right here, the train wreck over the Sacramento River. They actually built walls along the train track now to prevent anything like that from happening again. Okay, in just a few short hours, these chemicals killed all the wildlife for miles downstream. And other changes like growth of a plant, like this, take place very slowly. So things can happen very quickly or things can happen very slowly. Now, sometimes changes happen so slowly that they're not even noticed for a very long time, like weathering of a rock. This is an example of that. This river right here at one point was way up here, and as over time, over a long period of time, it weathered away all this rock. Remember we talked about sea arches? At one point, this was one entire wall, and as the waves crash into it, the water is weathering the rock and causing the sea arch. Now, over time, what's going to happen to this section right here? Yeah, more weathering will occur, and eventually we'll get a sea column, and maybe even after that, we'll see that this doesn't exist anymore. But again, this takes a long time to happen. What's happening here in the desert? What weathering occurred here? Yeah, wind. Okay, wind kept hitting the rock right here where it was weakened, and over time, it's created this circle. And as time goes on, it's going to get bigger and bigger. You might not see it in your time, but maybe your kids or grandkids will see at some point this hole getting super big. Okay. Now, changes do not happen by chance. Each change, whether it's big or small, is planned and controlled by God. Now, some changes are part of what we call a cycle or a regular pattern of change. And God uses these cycles to maintain his earth. He promises that they will continue. Let's look at Genesis 8:22. It says, God says, as long as the earth endures, seed time, that means like planting time, and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. These are all cycles that occur. Now, we know that there are different cycles that we've already looked at. We have our seasons. This would be a change in cycle. We have spring, summer, fall, winter. All these different changes here. We went through all of our seasons. We have wet season and dry season. Right now I'm reading the book A Long Walk to Water, and they had the wet season and they had the dry season. This is the same place, just different times of year. We have what we call the carbon cycle, and how we get carbon from our plants into the air, and usually it's through photosynthesis as well. We're not going to really dwell too much on that. Carbon cycle also helps with decomposition. I know this is gross, sorry I didn't warn you. These are the stages of a pig decomposing. When this happens, carbon gets released back into the air. So even things that die benefit and help our ecosystem. Then we have we're going to keep going, our nitrogen cycle. And our nitrogen cycle is just another way to put gases back into the air that we need. Usually nitrogen combines with oxygen during lightning strikes. And we get nitrogen in our plants, in their roots, called nodules. And we'll keep going. Again, it happens in decomposition and decomposers. We have our water cycle, which we talked about. Again, it's another type of cycle that occurs. So what happens when there is an unexpected change in the environment? What happens when this unexpected change can cause an ecosystem to not be able to function normally? Let's look at this. A river might overflow its banks and flood nearby fields and towns. You can see here's the river, but look where the water is, way over here. So there's been some major flooding. Maybe fires might burn down a forest and force animals and people to flee to safety. Or droughts could dry up a water supply, causing crops to fail and soil to erode. As you see, this is a dead fish here. So there's different stresses that are happening on our ecosystem. Well, what is a stress? Some of you guys know what stress is because you don't handle stress very well. Some of you are like, stress? I don't even know what that is. My life is great. But even our earth undergoes stress. Stress is any physical hazard to life caused by having too much or too little of things needed for life. And these stresses were not a part of the world when God created it. They've come into the world because of sin. So let's think about stresses in our life. Sometimes school can be a stress for us. Having too much school can be a stress for you, but can having not enough school be a stress for you? I think it can, because when you get put into the real world and you don't know how to do certain things, that can lead to stress, right? Not enough food could be a stress. Not enough shelter could be a stress. Not enough clothing could be a stress. But how does that apply to our ecosystem around us? What would be the things that too much or too little in our ecosystems that would cause stress? Usually, those are tragic disasters. Animals may die or be forced to move, plants may be uprooted or burned, but despite all these stresses, God still maintains his earth. Every time there's been a horrible disaster, our ecosystem has been designed to fix itself and go back to how it was, sometimes even better. So we're going to look at fire first, okay? A lot of forest fires are started through our carelessness, whether it's a cigarette or a fire that hasn't been set correctly, like a bonfire or something. Other forest fires are caused naturally by something like lightning. Either way, fires can cause ecosystems to undergo this quick and sudden change. Fires are often thought of as being destructive or harmful. Sometimes, though, a fire can be beneficial to an ecosystem. So here is the first part. This is before a fire happened. This is after the fire came through. You see the difference between these two? There's a lot going on here, and then everything has been burned up. But wait a second. What is this third picture? This is about 2 weeks after this picture here. What is happening? Yeah, all these plants are starting to grow back. Remember when I showed you the pictures of the carbon cycle and nitrogen cycle? When things get burned, carbon and nitrogen get released back into the soil, and these are really good for plants. They grab onto that and it helps them grow in a much better way. So you can see how these plants have actually taken what's been burned and used it for their good. So forest fires get rid of all those dead trees and branches, those pine needles and other things that could cause larger fires. For this reason, some fires are allowed to burn until they burn themselves out, as long as they're in control. We have these people that watch these fires to make sure they don't get out of control. And any fire that threatens the safety of people, we put out as soon as possible. But you can see how they're patrolling this. Sometimes they will burn things on purpose. It's called a prescribed fire. We get this a lot out here in the acreage, or out in Belle Glade, and they'll burn all the dead things that are on the ground as long as it's in control. You have firefighters that are in control of it. And the reason they do that is to make sure, there's two reasons. The first reason is they make sure that all the dead things are burned so that if, let's say, lightning struck, it's not going to cause a bigger fire. We've already taken care of all the dead things, because live things are very hard to burn, okay? That's reason one. Second reason is if we're trying to clear a field, let's say like the sugarcane fields out in Belle Glade, we clear them by burning them, and all those nutrients get put back into the soil, so the next time it comes to plant the seeds for them, we have some good nutrients in that soil. Now, fire causes nutrients from dead trees and plants to be recycled into the soil, like I just said. These nutrients make the forest rich, the soil rich and fertile, and some plants actually have seeds that will sprout only after a fire. For instance, these lodgepole pines, they will stay closed, these pine cones will stay closed until heat opens them up. And once heat opens them up, they're allowed to release their seeds, and we can get more of those trees. So there's a benefit, right? And over time, these new forests grow to replace those that were burned. Sometimes this could take many years, but this new forest is not exactly like the ones that it replaces. It often has a greater variety of plants and animals than the old one did. So as you can see, there's some benefits and some downsides to forest fires. and stresses, but usually there are a lot of good benefits there. What you're going to do is you're going to answer the questions that are below and email those to me about stresses and about forest fires. I will see you guys on Thursday.